Hi, Julie Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. Today I've got a fun back-to-school project, cookie project, which you can assemble in advance. They're actually 3D bookworm cookies, and they're a variation of my cookies that I showed in my book Cookie Swap, but I've jazzed them up for back to school by adding little nerdy eyeglasses and also a little base of wafer paper that looks like pieces of book that the worm has kind of chewed through. So, as I was going to say, you can either assemble them in advance and make a nice little centerpiece out of them for a kid's party, or you might even consider making the elements of the worm, like this little segment, in advance, leaving them unassembled and creating kind of a party out of it, you know, getting the kids together to put them together. So there are lots of different ways to make this interactive and fun for kids too. So there are a number of steps to this project. We're going to start first with icing the segments. What you'll need are about 12 3/4 to 7/8 inch cookie rounds. These are my gingerbread recipe, and two of them are going to form a segment of the worm, so you'll have 6 that ultimately get assembled together. One of the segments has a gumball in it to form the head, so you'll need, these are about 3/4 inch gumballs, one for each bookworm. And then the tail, I don't know if you've noticed it, but I've got a little bit of a little candy on there too. These are Skittles. So one of the segments will have one of the Skittles stuck on the end. And then if you do want to put it on the wafer paper elements to look like it's chewed through a book, I will mount it on a rectangular cookie. This is maybe 2 by 4 inches long, iced. It could be uniced. We're just going to stick the paper over it to cover it. The paper is edible. That'll be done in the next step. Oh, and one other candy element you'll need are for the little feet. I've used a licorice wheel. I've unwound it and I've cut it into little segments to form the feet. So those are the elements we'll start with. I'll introduce a couple of other little elements as we go. So let's start first with getting the segments decorated, and they'll need drying time. So this is something you want to do in advance so that they're dry enough to assemble later on. I've got a green royal icing. I'm just doing them in green, which is relatively thick top coating consistency. I want it pretty thick because, as I said, I'm going to put a gumball into one of them to form the head, and if it's too thin, it'll just roll on out. So I'm going to do the head segment first. I'm just going to start by piping a blob of icing in here. It's pretty thick, as I said, so it's not going to flow into a nice flat shape on its own. I'll probably have to pat it down with my trusting needle to get any peaks out of it. That's plenty of icing. Now I'm going to stick the gumball in. This is the head piece, to remind you. I like to set it a little bit towards the top. And if you want to put an antenna on it, you can. These are little wire stamens that are used for making gum paste flowers. Not edible, of course, so you'd want to warn people to take these out and not eat them if they were going to use them. So they're purely optional, but I like to stick one right at the top of the head. This is going to be the top of the head, into the icing and let it dry like so. That one's flopping a little bit. You could prop it with a touch of paper towel if the antennae are leaning, which I'm going to do here until it dries. Similarly with the tail, we're going to use a little orange Skittle so the head and tail match colors. And just flop that in the center, push it down a little bit. And then you've got an end piece. You'll notice on the little worm I've got in front of me, he's got little stripes of color that were formed by piping little dots around the green. I've done 2 layers of dots, orange and yellow here, but you wouldn't want to add the dots right away. Your best bet is to let that green completely dry and then add the dots. But I'm going to give you an example of how I would do that on just a plain segment. So those are the head and tail segments. All the rest of the pieces, the other 10 pieces, would just be iced like so. A little bit of green, and then with the borders put down on them, the dot borders. But see how thick that is? It's not kind of falling into a nice round on its own. It's got a little peak. And that was essential for keeping the gumball in place. As I said, otherwise it would have rolled around. But I can loosen it up to do these segments a little bit, or just knock down some of the peaks with my trusting needle, and that should be pretty good. Again, normally I would wait for the icing to completely dry before adding dots, but just to give you an indication of how I finished these segments off, I'm now working with a yellow icing of beadwork consistency, and I've got my consistency adjustments on my website. I just pipe dots right next to the edge all the way around. And you can do one row of dots, which is all I'm going to do here today because my icing is pretty wet. Or you can do a double row of dots as I did on the ones that we'll be assembling, which are now completely dry. First, let me show you how I made the feet. This is a Haribo licorice wheel, which is perfect for this because when you unwind it, it stays a little bit curled, which gives some shape to the feet. You can also use licorice lace, but it'll be straighter. And it comes two together, so I have to separate it like so. And then I snip them maybe to about 3/4 to 1 inch lengths. You can always trim them shorter if they're not all exactly the same length once they're dry and assembled on the caterpillar. So you want to cut enough for your worm, and if you've got 6 total segments or 12 sandwich pieces, then you need 12 legs. So if you'd like, you can work on a little bit of bubble wrap too, because you're going to be putting these pieces upside down, and there's more of a chance of some of those dots rubbing off if you're working just directly on rough cardboard or a cutting board. And you could use any color on the inside. I like to alternate colors. Okay, so I've got my orange blob of icing down, and it doesn't matter if it's not perfect because it's ultimately going to be a sandwich. So you want to place one little licorice leg to either side with the feet kind of pointing down. This is going to be the bottom. And then sandwich another one on top. I like to push just enough so that the orange squishes to the side. Okay, I am back with some pieces that I had dried overnight, done previously, while the ones I just did are drying. And I'm going to show you how to put them all together. Here's my segment with the head. Here's my tail segment. And I'll need 3 or 4 others to fill out in between. All I'm going to do now is just a gluing technique. I've got a thick royal icing glue. It's green to match the green body, so it's less likely to show. And the thicker it is, the faster it'll dry. So I've added some powdered sugar to it, get it to the right consistency. Now to mount the head, you could just stick 2 segments together like so, but the head would be kind of lying on the surface. And I love it when they're kind of propped up, like on this orange one here. So he's kind of looking up at you. So to do that, because the gumball is kind of heavy, you do need to prop under the head with a little bit of bubble wrap or paper towel to give it some lift until it's completely dry. I'm going to turn this sideways. So what I'm doing is just piping a little bit of glue there and then sticking the next segment onto it. And you want your feet pointing down, so none are sticking up in the air. If you want to give a little lift, like on this orange guy, his middle segment is lifted. You can also prop up with a little bit of bubble wrap underneath the segment to give it a little bit of height. But I'm just going to go ahead and put the rest of the segments on kind of at ground level. You can line them all up straight, or if you want to give a little curve to the worm, a little bit offset like so. So I'm going to have them bending around toward me. So I'm going to offset this one a little bit too. And you'll notice that the green icing doesn't show so much because I've matched exactly to the body color. I'm working on cardboard because obviously this is going to take a while to dry and I'm not going to be able to lift it immediately. This way I can work on one, put it to the side, bring out another piece of cardboard and work on another one while this one is drying. Okay, and I'm going to put the tail on last. So he's got a nice little bend to him. At this point, you could add details like the dots. I've got dots down the back and little white dots on the feet, black dots down the back. I've got black icing of beadwork consistency. Again, that forms a nice dot on its own without much work. It's relatively loose. And I'm just going to put a big dot right down the center on each orange segment. You could do, again, whatever you really want here. Might even put a couple little dots on his forehead. I'm going to turn him toward me to do that. might be enough because I've got to fit glasses. He's almost done except for white details on the feet. Again, icing of beadwork consistency for this. You don't have to do any details on the feet, but I tend to think there's beauty in details, so a few little white dots. Because the head might still be a little bit loose on here, I'm going to set this to the side. I'm going to show you how to do the paper base, the wafer paper base, and then come back and put the glasses on him when he's fully secure. Okay, so to work on the base, what I've done is I've made a bunch of little paper fragments using wafer paper, which is an edible paper, and I've got a whole video on working with edible papers. These have all been stamped with various rubber stamps and food coloring to create the sense of real live paper. And I'm just going to show you an example of how I did one. I've got brown food coloring that saturated this ink pad, and I've got a recipe card stamp that I've sanitized. I don't want the recipe part on it, so I'll end up tearing that off. But we'll go ahead and ink this, and sometimes with these big stamps, again, it's easiest to ink it this way. Otherwise, the stamp lifts up the stamp pad. And just stamp as you normally would with craft paper and crafting, scrapbooking, to create the impression. And I jazzed this one. I'm going to rip it now. You could cut it, but I like the sense of torn paper. So just rip through it. It's rather brittle paper to create a little paper fragment. And you can get creative by using different colors and different stamps. I've got little letter stamps, so I'm going to stamp a little letter A on here. If you don't have uninked stamp pads, this was once uninked before food coloring went on it. You can also use paper towel. That's a nice solution. I'll just put a little letter A here as if this were somebody's work paper. And then that could form a piece that we then stick on that white little platform. Let me bring that over, and I'm going to just show you how I glue those pieces down. Again, it's nothing more than a gluing process with royal icing. I would wait a little bit for them to make sure the food coloring on top of all the paper has dried before you glue it, because you will be pressing a little bit and you don't want to smudge it. I'm using a little bit of white icing, and a loose icing is okay here. Loose or thick, it doesn't really matter. Here's an example of where I smudged the ink. It was too wet earlier on. And I like to just put it at odd little angles. If you wanted to do one big sheet, that would be fine too. Just cover up the whole base. And you don't need to use the base either. Another great way to display these is to grind up graham cracker crumbs and just stick the little caterpillars in that. Looks like they're kind of crawling through sand or dirt, which is kind of fun. I often do that instead. But I wanted to make this kind of special for back to school, so this gives it kind of more of a bookish feeling. Okay, so that's an example of a base. I'd let it dry, and then when my worms dry, I would just slide it on top. So these eyeglasses are nothing but royal icing transfers. Again, a process of piping them out in advance, letting them dry, and then I lift them off the acetate to place them where I exactly want them. This allows them to stick off the edge of the face without drooping. You know, if I were to pipe them directly onto the gumball, they'd have to conform to the face, but I like the fact that they stick off to the sides a little bit. So this was done through a transfer technique. I piped these previously. I've got a whole nother video where I'm actually going to show how I made these. I just want to show you how I lift them off. So for instance, this is one here. They're pretty fragile, so I'll take a really thin bladed knife to make sure I get it up. There's quite a high possibility of it breaking right in the center. You'll notice maybe that the glasses on this guy are kind of shiny. That's because I applied some corn syrup to them to give it that sheen. It dries shiny. This one is really dull because I don't have the corn syrup on it yet, and I find it's easier to put the corn syrup on after it's on the worm, because otherwise the corn syrup is sticky and I can't really get the worm, the eyeglasses off my hands. And I'm just going to use a little bit of my thick white royal icing to anchor this in place. Just a little dab of icing where you want it. And stick those glasses in place. Got a little extra icing here showing, and I might just knock that out with my trussing needle. I'd let that dry completely, and then I'd come back in and glaze those eyes with a little bit of corn syrup. If I do it now, there's some probability of me taking those glasses off as I paint with the corn syrup. So I'm going to dry it for a couple minutes and come back and give it a little paint job, and we'll be done. Okay, I'm back. He's dried a few minutes. Hopefully both the head segment and the glasses are stuck on firm enough that I can give him a little bit of a gloss. If not, just give it a little more drying time. Now I've just got straight up corn syrup here in a tiny paintbrush, and I'm just going to paint not the black rim, but the eyeglass portion of the glass to give it that shiny effect. And again, this is purely optional, but I just think the details often make these projects, and this is one of those details. So there, and it'll dry shiny just like that. Now, how to get it onto the little papered base that we made earlier. I wouldn't want to do it now because this guy hasn't dried more than 15 minutes, and typically I'd give it several hours, if not overnight. But at the time that you want to move it, just bring your platform, your little base, very close to it. Get a very large and wide offset spatula, the largest and widest you can find. This is one I use. Pick up the whole caterpillar and sort of slide him onto the surface. That's how I move it. There's some chance for him breaking at the segments because the glue, the point of contact with the glue is quite small. If that should happen, just reposition it here and add a little bit more glue, and your worm should stay together. So that's it for this back to school project. I look forward to talking to you next time. Live sweetly.